Welcome to the Savannah Sideways podcast, the strange story of Savannah's ancient Roman statuary. I am your host, Jessica Leigh Lebos. Episode 2, If the Land Could Talk. When we left off, I was telling you about my predilection for wandering around Savannah's cemeteries, and how I learned that an incredible estate once stood upon the land that is now Greenwich Cemetery, including a collection of marble statues imported from Rome, some almost 2,000 years old. I only found out about the statues when the city council voted to sell off half of them, a decision that it seemed like it warranted more information. I had no idea how far and wide my curiosity would take me, and how deeply these statues symbolize where not just Savannah, but America has been and where it's going. Now listen, I'm a writer, not a historian, not an archaeologist, not an archivist. I'm just a nosy lady who loves a good story. The stories we tell are how we make sense of the past and bring meaning to the present. They connect us to each other and to those who come after us. But it's important to remember that not every story gets told, and also that not every story told is true. I've done my best to make sure what follows is as accurate and complete as possible, thanks to help from actual historians and archaeologists and archivists, a few of whom you'll meet later. But even they don't have all the answers. They've all wished me good luck in wrangling this tale about how a few objects can mean so much. Let's start with this little slice of land itself. The story goes that in February of 1733, General James Oglethorpe, along with 114 men, women, and children, cruised the ship Anne 17 miles up the mouth of the Savannah River to land on a high bluff and claim it as the 13th and last colony for the British Crown. He called it Georgia, after King George II. He wasn't the mad one, that was his son. Now, of course, there were already people here. A small band that called themselves the Yamacraw had settled on the bluff a few decades before in the aftermath of a war between the Creek and Yamasee tribes. Their chief, Tomochichi, established a friendly relationship with Oglethorpe, providing translation services and keeping the peace between his people and the colonists. In fact, their alliance became so strong that Tomochichi traveled back to England with Oglethorpe the following year, and a busy supply chain for the new colonists was established by Mary Musgrove, a mixed-race entrepreneur who ran a trading post on the river. All of this seemed to herald a positive and productive situationship between the immigrants to the New World and its indigenous residents. Unfortunately, we know that was not the case. The fate of America's native peoples is horribly tragic. After Tomochichi's death in 1739, the Yamacraw's influence waned, and most were absorbed back into the Lower Creek tribe, who were forcibly resettled to Oklahoma in the 1830s on the Trail of Tears. Their descendants are now part of the Muskogee Nation, who continue to carry out their traditions and culture. For his part, Oglethorpe tried to create an egalitarian society for Savannah. Unlike the massive plantations founded in the Carolina colonies, Georgia was established for England's worthy poor, where the settlers could eke out a decent living farming for themselves rather than amassing fortunes. Oglethorpe gave out small parcels of land and laid out his famous grid plan centered around public squares. The new city promoted religious freedom, welcoming a shipload of Portuguese-descended Jews that arrived just a few months after Oglethorpe's landing, and it helped that there was a doctor on board to treat the yellow fever already plaguing the colony. However, Catholics were not allowed in the new settlement, as it was the religion of the hostile Spanish colonizing the Florida Peninsula to the south. The general also instituted other bans: no booze, no slaves, and no lawyers. None of those lasted long. By 1754, Savannah was just as drunk, oppressive, and litigious as everywhere else. Plantations cultivating rice, cotton, and other commodities with the use of enslaved labor began sprouting up outside Oglethorpe's planned utopia. In 1764, an English entrepreneur named Samuel Bowen purchased 450 riverside acres in the hamlet of Thunderbolt, named after the legend of a spring that burst forth from a rock after being hit by a bolt of lightning. A former seaman who worked for Britain's East India Tea Company, Bowen named the property Greenwich, after the historic London region. He'd spent a lot of time in China and smuggled back some seeds that would have a tremendous effect on the economy and history. Chinese vetch, better known as soy. After a few test runs on nearby Skidaway Island, Bowen, and ostensibly his enslaved crew, sowed at Greenwich the first crops of soybeans grown in all of North America. Bowen actually registered the first known patent for soy sauce in 1769. Today, soybeans are one of the most widely farmed and consumed commercial crops in the country. They're used in everything from biodiesel to my favorite coffee creamer. And it all started at Greenwich Plantation. But that's far from the only significant piece of lore to come from this particular spot. By 1779, the Revolutionary War was in full swing, and after the British had failed to regain control of its northern colonies, its military leaders put their focus on the South, where loyalists were less resistant to their English overlords. The city of Savannah was under British command when it was attacked by a combined cavalry of American and French forces, including an all-black regiment from the French colony Saint-Domingue that would later have its own revolution to become Haiti. The siege of Savannah ultimately failed, but it yielded one of the Revolutionary War's most renowned heroes. Casimir Pulaski was a Polish-born military commander, exiled from his own country after heading up the losing side of a revolution. He was kicking around Paris looking for a new war to fight when he was recruited by founding father Benjamin Franklin, who was in town drumming up support for American independence. Pulaski made his way to Boston with a glowing recommendation letter from Franklin and proved his value in the first 3 months by saving George Washington's life at the Battle of Brandywine. That got him promoted to brigadier general, and he got to form his own independent cavalry, though his soldiers complained about having to take orders from someone who barely spoke their language. Still, he earned a reputation for bravery, often described as reckless, and would fearlessly charge into battle mounted upon his trusted steed. When Washington sent him to the swampy southern front to help take back Savannah from British occupation, he directed his unit as an advance guard for French admiral and nobleman Count d'Estaing. The history books note that on October 9th, 1779, after a delayed assault on British forces, Casimir Pulaski rode towards the enemy with his signature wild courage and was hit by a blast of grape shot, dying 2 days later from the wounds. What happened next is a topic of great debate. In one version of events, the general was whisked off the battlefield onto a ship bound for Charleston, but died of gangrene on the way. His body dropped in the water with a solemn salute. By another account, the bleeding Pulaski was taken to Greenwich Plantation, where the Count d'Estaing had set up camp. And here he was tended to until his death by Samuel Bowen's widowed wife, Jane, who directed her slaves to bury him in an unmarked grave between the mansion and the Wilmington River. That's the version I'd always heard, and it exists on the Greenwich Plantation Wikipedia page today. But it's yielded a lot of controversy through the centuries, spurring multiple exhumations of Pulaski's remains, as well as the widespread theory that he may have been intersex or born female. A wild assertion for a celebrated American patriot. For clarification, I consulted Dr. Lisa Denmark, a professor of history at Georgia Southern University.
It gets really hazy because there's the myth of Pulaski, and then there's all of the military eyewitness accounts at the time.
Those eyewitnesses are pretty clear the brigadier general was not placed in solid earth.
The guy who was with him wrote at the time, said at the time, he was boarded on the ship Wasp, and he died, as they were heading towards Charleston, and his body started stinking, so they couldn't wait to bury him, so they, buried him at sea.
How do you bury someone at sea? What does that mean?
They dumped him overboard.
Okay, so then where did this other story come from? Aren't there also accounts that saw him brought to Greenwich?
So let's start with nobody cared about Pulaski until the 1820s.
That's when another Revolutionary War hero, the French general, the Marquis de Lafayette, made sort of a greatest hits tour of the city he'd helped liberated from the British crown. Some say that when he announced a visit to Savannah in 1825 to commemorate the war's fallen warriors, the city wanted to make sure that they had one.
Right. That's when people started thinking about our Revolutionary War heroes, because we really didn't have any from Savannah. I mean, we could claim to have some, but, we don't have a Washington, right? We needed to sort of tie ourselves to the Revolution. Everybody was kind of doing this, right? Because you're starting to see the death of a lot of the, fathers, founding fathers, right? But mostly it had to do with Lafayette coming. And it's at that point that people started wondering, what happened to Pulaski. And they assumed, the story was he got thrown overboard. In the 1850s, once again, because now the city's moving southward, and we're establishing more, squares, Monterey Square, and Richard Arnold, who was mayor at the time, wanted to build a monument to Pulaski. One of the guys on this committee was William Parker Bowen. His family owned Greenwich.
Okay, just to keep track, that makes him the grandson of Samuel and Jane Bowen. Another side note, his name appears in the writings of 19th century Savannah historian Charles C. Jones, who presumably knew him personally and describes William P. Bowen as a vagrant and a drunk.
He's on the committee. So they start researching Pulaski, right? Do we know where he's buried? I guess knowing where he was, if we can find the remains, then we can raise money for the monument kind of thing, right? So they searched for 2 years with no luck. And then Bowen suddenly remembers that he was told a story by his grandmother that they knew that he was dying aboard ship, and they brought him to Greenwich, and that is where he died, and he was buried on a creek under a big tree.
So that's actually the first documented mention of Casimir Pulaski being buried at Greenwich, almost 80 years after the fact. In addition to her store of knowledge, Dr. Lisa is also citing a 2022 research paper authored by Dr. James Pula, a Polish-American history professor at Purdue University. The paper is based on primary sources of Pulaski's death, which make a compelling case for the burial at sea. Pula also brings up another issue with William Bowen's story. His grandparents were proud loyalists. It makes you wonder why the Americans would bring their wounded star general there and why Jane Bowen would welcome him. But apparently no one questioned this in the 1850s because the committee went out to Greenwich and started digging around, and what do you know, came up with a medium-sized skeleton that fit the bill. That tickled pockets enough to raise the money for the memorial, and the bones were reinterred under the monument built in 1853 in Monterey Square. No, not Pulaski Square. And if that doesn't tell you something about how Savannah works, I don't know what does.
Well, you got to think about Bowen's position. He was on the committee, so if you're on a memorial committee, that's one of those entries into Savannah politics and leadership. And if you want to, I guess from his position, if you want to move up, you need to establish your bona fides, right? And being from a loyalist family, maybe he thinks is not a good idea. So, having Pulaski cared for by his loyalist grandparents and, buried would, make him look better.
It's not fair to say that no one questioned it. Dr. Lisa says that Charles C. Jones, the historian, rejected the whole idea and reported that William Bowen was supposed to speak at the dedication of the memorial, but he was too drunk, which also tells you a lot about how Savannah works.
It is a really good story. Savannah has a lot of really good stories that are not true.
But the argument that the remains found at Greenwich belonged to Casimir Pulaski persists. It does seem pretty odd that one of the Revolution's greatest fighters would be unceremoniously dumped into the sea on the short ride from Savannah to Charleston. And there are other historical records that characterize William Bowen as a fine, upstanding gentleman. His grandmother and his Aunt Elizabeth Ann Bowen very well could have witnessed the burial at Greenwich. In fact, there is a book about Savannah from 1889, published long after all these people were gone, that contains an old poem attributed to Elizabeth about her childhood memory of the incident. Plus, there's the science. When the monument was being renovated in 1996, the bones were dug up again and studied by renowned forensic archaeologist Dr. Karen Burns. DNA samples that were compared to those from Pulaski relatives buried in Eastern Europe were inconclusive. But those in the Greenwich camp pointed out that the skeletal injuries on the right hand, head, and tailbone matched the general's, and the pelvis had scarring distinctive to someone who had spent a lot of time on a horse. The examination also revealed something else very interesting about them bones. The pelvis had a characteristically feminine shape, and the facial features were far more fine and delicate than might be expected from such a feisty warrior. In 2015, 2 Georgia Southern researchers retackled the case, analyzing the grape shot taken from Pulaski's body and other data with improved DNA technology. Their conclusions were compelling enough for the Smithsonian Channel to sign on for a documentary and provide funding for the lab work, and this time there was a mitochondrial match. This, along with the feminine nature of the bones, has led many to believe that not only do they belong to Pulaski, but that he may have been intersex, that is, possessing sexual characteristics of both genders, due to a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia. Or he may have been a woman passing as male, making his heroic military career all the more remarkable and important to American history. As of now, the death of war hero Casimir Pulaski remains a mystery yet to be resolved. Until it is, it will be inextricably linked to Greenwich. That was a lot. Let's take a little break. Is it time for your annual eye exam? Dr. Erica Morrow and the staff at Foresight Unique Eyewear and Eye Care in historic downtown Savannah provide a high-level professional experience that is clearly above the rest. Dr. Morrow provides eye care personalized to your needs. Plus, you'll find the coolest, highest quality selection of frames in town. It's all about the optics. Schedule your appointment today at foresigheye.net. When people ask me about the best seafood in Savannah, there's no hesitation. I send them to Bubba Gumbo's on Tybee Island. This is a family-run, water-to-table situation where you can be sure that whatever you're served, perfectly grilled, blackened, or fried, was swimming in the sea this morning, and the guy who reeled it in is probably sitting at the bar. If you'd rather cook at home, BG Seafood Co-op next door can hook you up with the same fresh fruits de mer that they're preparing in the kitchen. And they'll even fillet it all for you and pack it on ice. And should you need a safe harbor to keep your boat, the Tybee Marina where it all goes down is happy to oblige you with a slip. Remember, my good people, friends don't let friends eat imported shrimp. Next time you're hankering for local seafood, head to Bubba Gumbo's and BG Seafood at the Tybee Marina on Lazaretto Creek. Around here, we already know that truth is stranger than fiction, and a lot more interesting too. If you love cemeteries and you want to delve deep into Savannah's most famous one, you need to meet Don Touton, better known as Bonaventure Don. He offers true stories galore as you stroll through the gravestones. No ghosts, no nonsense, but you might see a wild fox. Whether you're a local or just making a pilgrimage to Savannah's iconic hallowed grounds, Bonaventure Don will give you an experience to last a lifetime, and perhaps beyond. Book a tour now at bonaventuredon.com. So now we have a little context for the land that is now Greenwich Cemetery, which was first named Greenwich Plantation. Through the 19th century, the property didn't see any more notable drama as the newly minted United States fought in the War of 1812, defending the Georgia coast from the British again. 1861 brought the Civil War, which I did once hear described as the War of Northern Aggression, but I'm pretty sure that person died of moonshine poisoning. As part of the Confederacy, Georgia sent its soldiers to the front, though other than some fortification work on the Wilmington River, Greenwich was pretty quiet, and Savannah didn't see any battle at all until the Union Army tromped through the state on its ruinous march to the sea. General William Tecumseh Sherman and his troops celebrated their triumph over Robert E. Lee by looting and setting fire to everything in their path, including the entire cities of Atlanta and Macon. Very importantly, they were liberating enslaved people along the way, though unfortunately, this was not as magnanimous as we'd like to think. The Union Army immediately started conscripting soldiers from this group of newly freed people, and many of the rest, who had nothing to eat and nowhere else to go, began following the infantry column on its march. About 600 were behind the Union ranks in December of 1864 when they came to Ebenezer Creek in Effingham County. And instead of allowing them to cross, the general at the back of the column ordered his troops to pull up the pontoon bridge, with the Confederates firing close behind. Rather than give up their newly won freedom, hundreds jumped into the river and drowned. This tragedy is now known as the Massacre at Ebenezer Creek. And after a huge public backlash, Sherman was forced to issue his famous Special Field Order No. 15, otherwise known as 40 Acres and a Mule. Though it never came to pass, you can still visit the Green Meldrum House where he signed it, right on Madison Square. When Sherman finally did arrive in Savannah, he found its citizens ready to surrender. The legend goes that he was so captivated by the city's beauty that instead of choosing arson, he sent a letter presenting it intact to President Abraham Lincoln as a Christmas present. Though surely the warehouses full of premium Confederate cotton had something to do with why Savannah was saved from the torch. Other than noting that it served as an important training camp for the Spanish-American War in 1898, we are done using the lens of war to define Greenwich and Savannah's history. We're entering the modern era, which means now it's all about money. By the last years of the 1800s, the city was really starting to feel itself, as we see now. After a serious debt crisis following the Civil War, the cotton, lumber, and rice industries were cooking along, as well as the naval stores business, which was the processing of pine trees into turpentine and rosin vital to wooden shipbuilding. Those who profited from those ventures lived large, building some of the city's most stupendous homes, and they also invested in municipal life. A regal city hall was built with a copper dome flanked by 2 statues representing art and commerce. Paved streets, sewer systems, and clean drinking water were all projects that were part of the aforementioned progressive era, and Savannah became something of a shining example of the times. Here's Dr. Lisa Denmark again.
By the 20th century, early 20th century, Savannah, which had always considered itself a city on the make, I would say was a city in the making. Savannah is making headlines in national periodicals for what stands as progressive reforms. Not in terms of politics, that's not the case, but in terms of city infrastructure. We hired a bacteriologist, which was something large cities were doing, becoming concerned with public health, doing tuberculosis clinics. So we started looking, like other cities in the nation in terms of those infrastructural reforms.
All of this attracted investment from up north and across the Atlantic. But it wasn't just clean water and smooth streets making Savannah sexy. Remember those to-go drinks I mentioned in the last episode? This place has always known how to party.
One other thing about Savannah in the early 20th century, that I'm selfish and it coincides with some of my other research. I wrote an article on Savannah's rebellion against Georgia Prohibition and the way that Savannah, the actual city government, helped saloons bypass the state laws, state prohibition laws beginning in 1908. So Savannah, even though Georgia was supposed to be dry during this, period of progressive reform, because prohibition was a progressive reform, Savannah remained good and wet.
Out at Greenwich, nothing else of note happened until just before the turn of the century. The property had changed hands a few times and been bought by Spencer Proudfoot Shotter, a Canadian-born businessman who had come to the States and was making a massive fortune in naval stores. He was referred to in the newspapers of the time as the John D. Rockefeller of his industry. And for sure, he was a peer of all those famous multimillionaires of the Gilded Age: Rockefeller, J.P. Morgan, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt. And like all of them, Shotter liked to show off his wealth. Now, most of those guys lived up north, but to get away from the harsh winters, anyone who was anyone built themselves a mansion on the Georgia coast. And in true American form, some bought up whole barrier islands for themselves, regardless of the people already living there. Really, the Carnegies had Cumberland, textile magnate Henry Cotton took Sapelo, J.P. Morgan, Joseph Pulitzer, and William Vanderbilt went in together on Jekyll Island, where they built a private castle and did all kinds of secret rich white guy stuff, like coming up with the Federal Reserve System. Shotter probably chose Greenwich because of its proximity to Savannah, where he conducted his business and ran with Savannah High Society. Records show that he was the largest single donor to the Oglethorpe Monument in Chippewa Square. We already know the cachet of being on a Savannah Memorial Committee. And he threw lavish parties chronicled in national newspapers. In 1905, the New York Times reported that he brought his entire staff, who were black, but that's not the word the article used, from Savannah to Lenox, Massachusetts, where he hosted an event at his other sprawling estate, Shadowbrook, specifically to cook a traditional Southern breakfast for 100 guests at the annual Berkshire Fox Hunt. Party favors, as described by the Times, were cotton picker dolls carrying baskets of real cotton blossoms. Yeah. So after buying up the ruins of Greenwich Plantation, Shotter renamed it Greenwich Place, and in 1898 hired New York architect firm Carrere and Hastings to design his millionaire winter palace. And if you're looking for their bona fides, plenty of their other buildings still exist, including the New York Public Library and the Metropolitan Opera House in Manhattan. Their resulting showplace at Greenwich was a 3-story mansion in the Beaux-Arts style of such opulence, it's going to leave me breathless describing it to you. 20-foot marble columns marked the entranceway into 40 rooms that included a ballroom, a billiards room, a library, a music room, a butler's pantry, 12 bedrooms, and 10 bathrooms. On the grounds around the main house, there was a 6-car garage, a chauffeur's cottage, a caretaker's cottage, a gate lodge, a separate laundry building, a 200-foot-long greenhouse, a dairy farm, a tiled bath and pool house with cathedral ceilings, horse stables, and a yacht dock. Whew. Shotter was also known as a prolific art collector and filled his new southern estate with priceless art, including the original cast of Hiram Powers' famous statue, Eve Tempted. He frequented auctions like the American Art Association's event in New York, where in 1903 he bought a pair of 16th century silvern flagons for $1,600 apiece. A single volume of the American Art Annual from that year shows he bought at least 10 paintings, perhaps with the purpose to decorate the many walls in need of adornment at Greenwich. He also bought art for the gardens. In the fall of 1907, Shotter and his second wife, Elizabeth Wallace Owens, of the Owens-Thomas House here in Savannah, went on a grand tour to Europe. The grand tour was a 19th century tradition of travel for the wealthy who would immerse themselves in classical art and architecture, learning to elevate their tastes and educate themselves in the aesthetics of Western civilization. During the Gilded Age, American millionaires revived this tradition, spending months in France and Italy, particularly Florence and Rome, where they marveled at sculptures and paintings from the Renaissance and the ancients. During this time, there was a fertile market for selling such antiquities to Americans who were experiencing their own European cultural moment, especially in Savannah.
So if you look at the municipal reports and the Gamble papers that talk about this time period, the sort of Italian Renaissance style, which was influenced by the 1893 Columbia Exposition, the White City, right? So Italian Renaissance and Roman statuary became kind of the thing. And I'm guessing Shotter really sort of internalized that.
Mr. and Mrs. Shotter definitely did their share of shopping on their trip. U.S. Custom records show that a shipment of 15 marble pieces was received in Savannah from the steamship Callisto from Rotterdam, Holland on July 16th of 1912, which means the Shotters waited almost 5 years for some of their treasures to arrive. Listed on the manifest are the double ram's head pedestals, the column tops, the sarcophagus, several busts, and 2 double-headed pillars called herms acquired from the Galleria San Giorgi, a prolific antiquities dealer that appears in museum archives around the world. Yes, we are finally at the statues. But this story has barely begun. Gosh, I'm exhausted. I'll tell you more in episode 3 of The Strange Story of Savannah's Ancient Roman Statuary. The Savannah Sideways podcast is brought to you by The 5 Spot. Ancient artifacts may be fragile, but the 5 Spot's new menu is rock solid. Classics like the signature meatloaf and chicken fried chicken are still part of the permanent collection, while new masterpieces like Todd's famous chili and loaded mac and cheese with Mojo pulled pork and collard greens have joined the rotating exhibit. These curators of comfort food present a lineup of juicy burgers and giant salads for lunch and dinner 7 days a week, plus their famous brunch every Saturday and Sunday that's overflowing with bloodies and mimosas. With locations in Sandfly, Habersham Village, and Richmond Hill, the 5 Spot has something delicious for everyone at your table. And by Ships of the Sea Maritime Museum. Housed in the historic Scarborough House, the Ships of the Sea Maritime Museum pays homage to America's great maritime past while expanding its lens towards some of the city's most exciting artistic voices. Wander through luxurious galleries of ship models and modern installations, amble amongst exquisite gardens, or attend, or host, an event at the finest open-air venue in town. Book it all at shipsofthesea.org. Special thanks to our friends under the Lincoln Oaks. If you're too dumb for Starland and too ugly for downtown, there is a seat at the table and a spot at the bar for you at 6B, Lone Wolf Lounge, Over Yonder, and Mood Rights. This little slice of shade in Midtown is where the most fun goes down. And by Shot by Somi, award-winning portrait and brand photography for every occasion. A photo isn't just an image, it's a story whispered through light and time. Book your session at shotbysomi.com. The Savannah Sideways podcast is produced by D. Daniels Media, female-owned full podcast production services for businesses, nonprofits, and special projects. Storytelling with a purpose. Go to ddanielsmedia.com.